Okay, so I'm going to show you where that unit circle comes with understanding. So instead of memorizing it, I want to show you how these values are created, and that will make it easier to solve any type of question. So we know that our quadrantal angle, so this is the 0. So this is going to all be in radians as a little hint to you. So at 0 radians, or 2 pi, which is also equivalent to 360 degrees, you're going to have the coordinates of 1 and 0 because the radius is 1. So that point on that unit circle where the radius is equal to 1 is going to be 1, 0. At 90 degrees, which is equivalent to pi divided by 2, that's going to be equal to 0 and 1. At 180 degrees, which is equal to pi, we're going to have the coordinates of -1 and 0 because we're on the opposite side. So it's like the reflection of 1 and 0. And then we have our point 0 and -1, which is also the reflection of that 90-degree angle. So this is 270, which is equivalent to 3 pi over 2. So you can always take 270 and divide it by 180 to get that 3 over 2, and then we just insert the pi in. Okay, so once we have these, we're going to start by filling in and writing down what our special triangles are. So we're going to draw the special triangles. So if you're looking from 30 degrees, so I'm going to draw it this way just to show you how I'm going to do this. So let's say you're looking from pi over 6. That's equal to 30 degrees. Opposite to 30 degrees should be, when we remember last year, 30 degrees was opposite of 1. Our hypotenuse is equal to root 3. Or actually, it should be 2. Our hypotenuse is 2, and the side that is opposite to pi over 3, which is 60 degrees, should be root 3. So my goal is to make the hypotenuse equal to 1, because if I can make the radius equal to 1, that's the same as my hypotenuse. So for all of these, for this first triangle, if I divide everything by 2, that's going to make my radius equal to 1, which is the same as your hypotenuse. So this is my new triangle that I'm going to be using, is where the hypotenuse is 1. We have our opposite side, 2 pi over 6, which is 30 degrees, is equal to 1/2, and our adjacent side is root 3 over 2. And now I'm going to draw another triangle using my reference as pi over 3. Pi over 3 is equal to 60 degrees. Opposite to 60 should be root 3, and we're going to use the same numbers over 2 because we want the hypotenuse to be 1 instead of just 2. So we divided all the values by 2. As long as you do it to everything, it's still equivalent. And then this adjacent side should be 1 over 2. Our third triangle that we need to draw is where we have our values of 45 degrees, which you guys know as 45, we know it as pi over 4. So that's that is our triangle looking from pi over 4. Now, since they're both pi over 4, we just need to write it once. Opposite to pi over 4, and your adjacent side should be 1, 1, and this should have been root 2. Again, just like in the previous triangles, my goal in this case for the unit circle is to get the hypotenuse to be 1. So the only way that's possible is to divide all the sides by root 2. So that will equal now 1. But for here, we need to rationalize. So that's going to be root 2 over positive 2. So root 2 over positive 2. Those are your new triangles that we've adjusted from 20-1 to be able to complete this unit circle and have everything rationalized without having to adjust anything later. So this saves us a lot of time later on. So when we're talking about the unit circle, the smallest angle that we're looking at is 30 degrees. So 30 degrees, remember, is equal to pi over 6. So remember the radius is equal to 1, and if we're looking from 30 degrees, the opposite to 30 degrees should be 1 over 2. The adjacent side to it should be root 3 over 2. The reason we only need those values is those give us our x and our y. When we're talking about coordinates, it's always your x and then y coordinate. And here, the bottom distance is root 3 over 2, that's your x value, and your height is 1/2 to get to that point. Okay, so that is our first coordinate on our unit circle. Okay, now we're going to go on to the next angle. Our next angle would have been 45 degrees. So 45 degrees as radians is equal to pi over 4. So pi over 4, if we write out the coordinates, we're looking at what is your opposite side to pi over 4. So that would be root 2 over 2. And your adjacent side to root 2 over 2 is root 2 over 2 as well. So those are going to be the same. So our adjacent side is your x coordinate, and your opposite side becomes your y coordinate because that's your sine value. And since we're dividing by 1, that's why it doesn't actually change. We're pretty much doing our sine is equal to opposite over 1, but since we don't have to divide by 1, that's why it just stays as what your opposite side is. So it makes it way easier to do this. And then our last coordinate is 60 degrees. 60 degrees is equal to pi over 3. So pi over 3, if we're looking at the pi over 3 triangle, we want to write that our x value will be the bottom, which is 1/2, and our y coordinate will be the height of that triangle, which is root 3 over 2. Okay, so that is all the first coordinates for quadrant number 1. So what's cool about this is now we can continue this triangle, and that's pretty much the hardest part, is doing that work right there. So if you can figure out what that looks like, then it makes the rest of the triangle easier. Okay, so when we're talking about a triangle, or when we're talking about this pi over 6, that means that this triangle is split into 6 sections. So I'll just show you with a color what that looks like, and I'll take it off. So this would be pi over 6. This would be 2 pi over 6. This guy right here would be 3 pi over 6, which is simplifies to pi over 2. This is 4 pi over 6. So I'm going to write 4 pi over 6. This would be 5 pi over 6. And then this would be 6 pi over 6, which simplifies to pi. So when you divide it that way, it makes it easier now to write out what the answers are, what those values actually are in radians. Well, 4 pi over 6 simplifies to 2 pi over 3. Okay, so we know that right there, that line is 2 pi over 3. Okay, so I'm going to erase this line right here and write 2 pi over 3 instead. And then 5 pi over 6 is already simplified, so we're going to write 5 pi over 6 instead. So we already know some of the sections of this unit circle. So those are simplified, and we don't have to then convert. The next number we need is, we need those 45-degree angles. So I'm going to erase these. So I'm going to use another color here to show you what I'm talking about. I'll use orange. So when we're talking about pi is being divided into 4 sections when we have 45 degrees. So that's one section. This is pi over 4. This would be 2 pi over 4, which simplifies to pi over 2. This would be 3 pi over 4. So we need to fill that out there. And then finally, 5 pi over 4 would be like that last part, which is pi, so we don't need to do that. So we're just filling out the rest of our triangles. And now I'm going to continue on. I'm going to start using that pink again just to show you. So remember, now we have, this would have been equal to 6 pi over 6, right, which is pi. This is now 7 pi over 6, because you're just adding another pi over 6 to it. This would be 8 pi over 6. This guy right here would have been 9 pi over 6, which simplifies to 3 pi over 2, so those are already done. This is 10 pi over 6. This is 11 pi over 6. Okay, so now I'm going to just go back and simplify all those numbers to get the answer. So we already have that 6 pi over 6 is pi, so we don't have to include that one. 7 pi over 6 is already simplified, so I'm just going to rewrite it. So 7 pi over 6. And then this one, 8 pi over 6. 8 pi over 6 simplifies to 4 pi over 3. Now, if you converted that, if you multiplied by 180 over pi, you would get that value would be 240 degrees. Okay, so that would be something that makes sense. It should be there, right? And then over here, so our next value we said was, that was 4. This is 8, 9, 10. This one was 10 pi over 6, which simplifies to 5 pi over 3. And then this one's 11 pi over 6. 11 pi over 6, already simplified. And then the last part we have to do is the 45-degree angle. So remember, this one was 4 pi over 4, which is pi. This guy would have been 5 pi over 4. 6 pi over 4. And this one would have been 7 pi over 4. And then finally, 8 pi over 4 is 2 pi. So that's why it makes sense. Okay, so that's how we can fill out this triangle without doing that. So this one's 7 pi. I'm going to write in black. 7 pi over 4. This one was 5 pi over 4. Okay, so what I just did was I filled out all the parts of the circle using how it's divided, right? So I filled everything out with radians. And now to actually finish up, I don't have to calculate what those values are. I can just use the side here. I can just use this answer right there. So I'm going to start with, oops, let's move that over. There you go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this answer here to calculate that one. And then it's going to help me actually calculate a bunch of them. It's going to help me calculate this one here when it's pi over 3. Whenever you see a 3 at the bottom, it's going to help me calculate this one and this one right here. So all of these, if you notice, they are reflections of each other. So whenever you have that pi over 3 in there, those are, the reference angle is 60 degrees there. So if I look at it, whenever we're in the second quadrant, the x-coordinate, meaning cos, should be negative, and the y-coordinate should be positive. So I'm using the same numbers of that yellow, but I'm just doing reflections of them. Okay, so that's our first one. Now, when we're in the third quadrant, both sine and cos are negative. So we're going to have negative 1/2 and then negative root 3 over 2. So all those yellow highlighted will have the exact same numbers, just the signs will change. And then when you're in the fourth quadrant, we have your cos being positive and your y being negative. Okay, so that's the first set. Our next set, let's do these ones. So these guys are all going to be the same. All the ones with pi over 4 in them. So for pi over 4, we're going to look at that root 2 over 2. We're going to know that the x-coordinate should be negative and the y-coordinate should be positive. In the third quadrant, they should both be negative. And in the fourth quadrant, the x should be positive and the y should be negative. And let's continue on. Now let's look at this, the 30-degree one, all the pi over 6's. So anything with a pi over 6 will be the same. They'll be reflections of each other. So for this one, we're going to have the x being negative and the y being positive. In the third quadrant, we have both of them being negative. And in our fourth quadrant, we have the x being positive, which is cos. That makes sense because of the cast rule. And our y becomes negative. Okay, so look at all these values. They should all make sense of why they're a certain way. So once I do that, now I can go back and answer some questions. So I'm going to delete what I had before and just show you how I'm solving these questions now using just understanding. Okay, so for this example here, example number 3, we have 5 pi over 6. So the coordinates for 5 pi over 6, I'm just going to highlight those. So 5 pi over 6 is this. That means the coordinates are negative root 3 over 2 and 1/2. Okay. So if you look at that, that always tells you your reference angle. And then the 5 pi over 6 tells you that if it was 6, anything over 6 pi over 6 would be in the third or fourth quadrant. But if you're less than 6 pi over 6, that means you're in the third or first quadrant, or second and first quadrant. So that's how we answer the first question, is just by looking at those answers. Okay, going on. So I just want to show you that if you Google the unit circle, you'll get the chart that I just created. So I just want to show you how I create these values with understanding and with logic versus memorizing stuff. Okay, so our next example, we just have to look at negative 4 pi over 3. So pi over 3, so I want to show you how that looks when it comes to understanding this. So I'm going to highlight this with another color. I'll use purple. So we're going in the negative direction to find the answer. So they want 4 sections of pi over 3. So this would be one section of pi over 3. This would be another section. So that would be 2, 3, 4, and that's it. So 1, 2, 3, 4 takes you to what coordinates? Well, you would write them down. So the coordinates, if you guys look at it, oh, sorry, that was 60 degrees, so I should go back. I was looking at it from 30 degrees. So if you're looking from, it says pi over 3. So pi over 3, guys, is actually this right here, every 60 degrees. So this would be 60 degrees. This would be another 60 degrees, so that would be 2 sections. This would be another, so 1, 2, we have so far. I'm just highlighting, this is 1 section of the pi, 2 sections of the pi, 3 sections of 60 degrees, and then you just have to go up to 4 sections of 60 degrees. So this would be 4 pi over 3. And the reason we did this, we had to go this way, guys, is because of the negative angle. Okay, so negative 4 pi over 3 means I need 4 sections of 60 degrees. So pi over 3 is 60 degrees. I needed 4 of them. So as you can see, I split my sections into 60 degrees and I have 4 of them. And that takes me to my answer, which is this right here. So if you guys look, that's what I recorded right there. The answer is negative 1/2 over root 3 over 2. So negative 1/2 over 3 over 2, that's the coordinates of negative 4 pi over 3. There you go. And our last one, they just want us to figure out what points have this coordinate. So you want to look at negative root 2 over 2 and negative root 2 over 2. We know that that's going to be in the third quadrant because they're both negative. So you just have to look at where we wrote both negative root 2 over 2. I should have a negative here, so I don't know why I don't have a negative there, guys. So when we have this answer here, we want to look for both of them being negative root 2 over 2, and that would be this answer right there. So we know that the angle that it occurs at is 5 pi over 4, and that's what I record for example number 4. That's it. Okay, they wanted the answer going in the positive direction from 0 to 2 pi. That's why we just had to look at the coordinates without having to think about